All right, we will get started. Wanted to thank everyone for joining the members of the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign for this webinar focused on addressing educator shortages through the lens of quality, quantity, and diversity. My name is Nithya Joseph, and I'm with TNTP, an organization working to ensure that the K-12 system is designed to deliver on the expectation that education will lift every generation, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Again, we are very excited to co-host this with the Education Trust and so grateful for your time today, spending this next hour and a half with us. Before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge the 3 children and adults who lost their lives in the senseless violence at the Covenant School in Nashville. We know that there are so many affected by this, and that we know that we also have people joining us from Tennessee. And so we really are holding the Nashville community in our hearts right now. These tragedies, as we know, have become far too common, and they're a reminder of how precious our children's and educators' lives are. When parents and caregivers send their children to school, and when educators go to work every day, they should not have to fear for their safety. But this is the reality for far too many across the country, and it is an acute reality for the Covenant School community today. And so we are truly keeping them, those parents, those families, that community, Nashville and Tennessee, in our hearts and our minds today as we begin today's discussion. Today's webinar is the first in a series under the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign that we're launching, and we're doing this aim to amplify best practice solutions and the policies to advance educator diversity in communities across the country. Since this is the first webinar in the series, we wanted to provide a brief background on the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign before we get started on our panel discussion. So we'll do that now. The 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign was launched with a bold and audacious goal to increase the teacher of color workforce by 1 million and our educators of color by 30, and our school leaders of color by 30,000 by the year 2030. When the campaign was initially launched, this was the calculation of what it would take to close the educator to student diversity gap. The campaign is catalyzed by a strong evidence base that shows the impact of teachers and school leaders of color on all students, particularly for those students of color. When students have teachers who reflect their racial and ethnic identity, they benefit across significant academic, social, and emotional measures. And the same is true for white students. Research shows that diverse learning communities provide these students with exposure to multiple perspectives that can improve their ability to solve problems, think creatively, and think critically. Additionally, school leaders of color are essential. They not only support the positive impact on students, and particularly students of color, but they are absolutely critical to supporting and retaining teachers of color in their school buildings, which offer a multiplying effect to the impacts on students. Put this in the context of a rapidly diversifying America, which will depend on a thriving workforce. This research makes it crystal clear that increasing educator diversity matters for the economic and social prosperity for all of us. But just as the research is clear on the impacts of educators of color, so is the research and the evidence and the data on the gaps that our country is facing, as you can see here. So intentional and collective work must be done to address these gaps. The 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign came together because of this evidence and because of the decades of experience each member that you see here on this screen that comprises our steering committee brings to this issue. The 8 organizations you see here bring unique perspective and focus to the work and years of experience to this issue, but we recognize that individual actions are not enough, that in order to meaningfully close this gap, collective action to multiply impact is absolutely necessary. The campaign rests on 3 main strategies, and we wanted to introduce this because we know that as we embark on this campaign over the next several years, it's going to take collective action, not just from the 8 organizations that comprise our steering committee, but from all the advocates that have joined this call and many others that we want to partner with as we pursue this work. Our first strategy focuses on policy change and strong policy implementation. We aim to do this at the federal, state, and local level. And we aim to do this in strong coalition with advocates who've been leading on these issues in their communities for years. The second strategy focuses on the narrative around educator diversity, specifically building up the importance and the urgency that people feel and understand when they think about educator diversity. We want to ensure that this is not a partisan issue and rather is widely recognized and accepted as a core staffing strategy that benefits students, the workforce, and ultimately our economic prosperity. The third focuses on building a network of champions and disseminating best practices. In order to scale what we know works, and in order to spark innovation in the field, this campaign intends to create spaces to bring together stakeholders like yourselves around educator diversity to share knowledge and strategies for what works. We're excited that you've joined us today, and we hope that you will continue to do so in the months and the years to come, as it will take stakeholders in every district and across every sector to reach our goal of advancing educator diversity. So if you've joined us and you're not officially a part of the campaign quite yet, we encourage you to do so. You can do that on our website. And thank you so much, Andy. Drop a link in the chat where you can join the campaign directly. And essentially, you'll get updates about our work and calls to action when we're active at various states and localities, and also hear more about the best practices that you're pursuing. So let's turn now to today's discussion. The topic of shortages, as our panelists know well, is not new to the education sector. In fact, we've been having it for decades. But as we collectively experience the impacts of the pandemic and its exacerbated inequities, the topic has reached a fever pitch. But the coverage on shortages can be confusing. In the course of 1 week, you might read about the prevalence of shortages everywhere, and then read about how there are more teachers on a numeric basis now than before the pandemic, and student enrollment is dropping. And so there's even more teachers than we had, compared to our student population before. The fact is, all of this can be true. And that's because educator shortages are not monolithic. They're not the same in every district across the country. They are local, and they hit certain geographies, certain subjects, and certain schools more than others. And they are increasingly a very real and serious challenge in the areas that they do exist, where it feels like the problem seems to be mounting. Exacerbated challenges facing our schools present more difficulties to those same districts and schools that faced staffing challenges pre-pandemic. While educator shortages are not monolithic, what is monolithic when it comes to staffing challenges, as our panelists know, is the gap between the students of color and our educators of color, both teachers and leaders. And so our panel, I'm very excited, will explore this topic in depth, specifically through the lens of quality, quantity, and diversity. They'll eliminate both how and why education policymakers and system leaders should embed a commitment to advancing teacher and school leader diversity in all efforts to recruit and retain educators in order to create a larger, higher quality educator corps that can better meet today's students' needs. And they will speak directly to the false choice that often arises in these discussions between quality and diversity. So with that, I wanted to welcome our incredible panelists to this discussion. Today, you'll hear from Lynn Jennings, the Senior Director of National and State Partnerships at the Education Trust, Kim Oliver, the Vice President of Strategy, Policy, and External Affairs at TNTP, Harrison Peters, the co-founder and CEO of Men of Color in Educational Leadership, and Sharif El-Mekki, the founder and CEO of the Center for Black Educator Development. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us. All right, so here we go. I'm going to pose some questions directly to each of you, and as I do, hope that as you begin your remarks, please say a little bit more about yourself and the role that you in your leadership on these issues. So first question starts with you, Lynn. I'll start with you. As I'm sure everyone joining us here knows, the Education Trust was one of the first national education organizations that began focusing on educator diversity. So from your perspective and the decades of experience in leadership from the Education Trust, how can practitioners and policymakers focus on quality and diversity when addressing teacher and school leader shortages in both the short term and long term? And if you could you speak to the necessary policies that have to be in place to create the conditions for state and district leaders to be able to focus on both of these things?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. First, I want to say on behalf of that trust that we are delighted that we're able to partner with the 1 Million Teachers of Color and TNTP for your first seminar for this campaign. So, and actually this partnership gets to the heart of what I do at that trust. We're an organization that's committed to working with partners and advocates who are committed to eliminating, addressing the disparities we see in our public school system. So you asked me a lot of questions, so I'm gonna try my best to get to some of them, and I'm sure others will get to through the conversation. But I want to start with EdTrust really got into this work about 6 or 7 years ago. This is before we had the pandemic, all the disruptions in schools. And at that time, what we were seeing is that there was, as you mentioned, there's already this conversation about a pending crisis with teacher shortages, concerns about not layoffs, retirement. And so what are we going to do in terms of making sure that we have a strong educator workforce moving forward? And what we wanted to do is make sure that in that conversation, we were thinking about the diversity of what was happening in the workforce. And we started with looking at just how many Black teachers, African-American teachers that we have in the workforce at that time. And what we saw was 7%. And we're like 7%. What the schools we know are becoming more and more students of color. And you went through all the reasons why we need a diverse workforce. So as our team dug a little deeper, what we realized as we were going through the research is that a lot of what we were seeing is that actually at that time, getting into the workforce, we had educators of color doing okay, getting into the workforce. Staying there was a huge problem, so the retention was a huge problem. And so we look back and we were thinking, if you can't retain the educators of color, teachers of color in the classrooms, what is going on in our classrooms is probably affecting our students. It's the whole environment, the climate and the culture, what's happening in the environment. And that will also get us to stronger policies and practices in terms of recruitment and retention, and just the overall experience of teachers and students. So I'm going to start with one of the main things that we've been driving for a long time. And that is, first of all, you've got to know what you're dealing with. And to know what you're dealing with means you've got to have the data. We have way too many places where we don't know. We're taking guesses at how diverse the educator workforce is, who's in the classrooms, et cetera. And so we've always been pushing it at Trust. Let's first get with what do we know? What do we need to know so we can ask the right questions? And then we can figure out and have more targeted strategies in terms of how do we address if what we're seeing is a recruitment issue, is it a retention issue, or is there something else that's going on in our schools and our school system? So transparent, actionable data on the school level, state level, is where we would always begin.
Thank you, Lynn. And when preparing for this discussion, one of the key refrains, even though the narrative around shortages can be confusing or offer many different points, one thing was clear is the data is just not there for folks to be able to assess what's happening and actually pinpoint. And so what you said at the top about being able to pinpoint what EdTrust did to pinpoint, like retention is where we have a lot of these problems, is imagine if every school district had that ability and that they could really target and then find the solutions that they need for their specific community, that would be transformative. You teed up my question for Harrison perfectly, talking about retention and that is a place where when we think about the leaky bucket of the pipeline, that's definitely a place where school leaders play. So Harrison, I'm going to ask you a jam-packed question, and other panelists get ready too, because I've got some other questions for you as well. But Harrison, for those joining us who aren't aware, the Men of Color in Educational Leadership holds an incredibly important perspective and brings a lot of important practice to the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign for many reasons, one of them being the focus on school leaders. And so one thing that's interesting about the conversation on shortages is that rightfully, teachers are very much a focus. School leaders, though, often feel left out of that conversation, and yet they have such an important role to play. So would love it if you could speak more about what is missing in the current nationwide discussion around educator shortages as it relates to school leaders from your perspective leading MCEL. And then why don't you answer that? And then I'm going to follow up with some other questions about best practices.
It's super exciting to be here, and we are certainly dealing with an incredibly complex challenge. And Nidhi, I just want to double click on something you said earlier about our hearts and our thoughts going out to our family in Nashville. The unthinkable happens, it continues to happen, and we've got to act with due haste to solve for that. And I believe the solutions are right at our fingertips. We've got to have the courage to just sort of go ahead and let it fly. We've got to be able to solve those problems, but also make those very tough decisions. I'll double click on what Lynn said earlier about the retention piece is critical. When I think about this challenge of leaders, part of what we don't always readily look at with our teachers of color are our men of color. We're less than 2% of the market. And we're leaving at a higher rate, and fewer of us are choosing education as a viable option. And that's where MSO comes in. We believe that if we don't intervene, and when I say we, the ecosystem, that men of color in educational leadership will reach an extinction level event within the next decade. I really think when we talk about policy and approaches to this opportunity, we're talking about a whole system approach. And I'll give you a little bit of a vignette from sort of one of our MCEL works. So we were contacted by one of our partners and said, hey, we heard about the work that MCELs are doing. We have north of 100 schools where we have one male leader of color, and we think that's a problem. And I said, yes, it is a problem. And I said, well, can you help us? And see, this is where the story gets complex. We said, yes. So talk to me a little bit about what you mean by help. Well, we've got 10 young men that we want you to come and coach and mentor. That's always a red flag for me. So one of the things that I shared, I'd love to come in and talk to those guys, maybe run an affinity space or focus group, just to unpack their opportunities and what's happening with them. If then I can come and have a conversation with you and the superintendent. This person happens to lead their leadership development work. So I came in and had a conversation with the gentleman, and they were saying, well, we don't want to be principals here because we saw how the system treated the last principal. They put us in the toughest positions and they don't give us the resources. They typecast us. And so all the things that we know happen. Well, that gave me the ammunition to sort of go back and sit with the superintendent and say, well, let me be very clear. We're not here to fix your Black and brown men. They're not broken. So I think we've got to be very careful as a campaign and as an ecosystem around the message that we're sending. Now, am I saying that we don't need to get better? I'm not saying that at all. We absolutely do. But we will come in and we will happily work with these young men if we can work with the area superintendent or the principal supervisor who actually walks through buildings and work with principals around identifying the next level of talent. If we can work with your HR person to look at your pipeline, like how do we look for talent, cultivate talent? What is the process to get into the pool? If we can work with the superintendent and the cabinet to say, hey, are we even designed at the central office level to morph to the daily needs of school? Is the principal role the destination role in our school district? So when I say this challenge is incredibly complex, you can't just look at it from let's go and recruit more people and retain them. You've got to have a system of supports in the system that goes all the way around from central office to the community, because the other piece that we talked about, what does leadership look like? And we've had this traditional mindset of what leadership looks like. There are leaders in our communities in every day that can be far more effective than some of the folks that are gracing the halls now. So when we talk about this challenge, Nidhi, and I'll be quiet, it is not just unpacking how do we get better, identifying you, putting you through a leadership development program, although that is a huge part. We have to really care about the conditions that we're creating in the entire organization for these leaders to be successful.
I think you saw some of the love happening on the Zoom there, Harrison. So you were speaking some truth. Looking at the folks who registered for the webinar, a lot of people are coming from districts, and a lot of people are advising HR offices on this very issue. So when you are working directly with system leaders, what are some of, and you talked about this, but just to, I think, crystallize it, what are some of the best practices at that level that you think that, and even, and maybe beyond practice, also policy, that you think are critical for those folks to keep in mind as they're trying to advance this?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. We know that we are in a teacher shortage, but I also believe that there is an absence of transformational leadership. Teachers come and go because they get the opportunity to work for great leaders. I would not walk out of my house and walk right across the street to work for a leader that's ineffective, but I will drive all the way across town to work for a leader that gives me agency, gives me voice, like all of those things. So leadership matters. So I guess my point here is it's for some reason it isn't as sexy to invest in leadership development as it is in teacher development. I think those developments and those investments have to be co-equal. We also know that there's new research out there that's saying building leaders have almost the same impact on learning as effective teachers. So that also sort of doubles down on the point that we should be investing. And the second piece is when we have looked at teacher data traditionally, I think we've looked at it, and I'll use the word you said earlier, in a monolithic way. Teachers, they vote on block. If 55% of the teacher says this is what we're going to do. Now we're starting to look at data, thanks to Ed Trust and TNTP and CBED, like what do teachers of color actually think? And in a recent study, we talked about teachers were asked, what is it that you want? And by and large, white teachers said, all teachers said, we want you to respect us, respect the profession, and we should get paid our value. And I don't know anybody, at least in my ecosystem, that disagrees with that. But when we start to drill down to teachers of color, they actually, top priority, I just want to be respected as a sound pedagogue. And that was an interesting piece to me. Money was important, leadership was important, but they wanted to be respected and that this is from their peers, from their community. So we've got to be very careful around now how we look at teacher data. We know 79% of teachers don't identify as a teacher of color. So that's, if you just use that aggregate data, you're always going to get that aggregate result. So we have to start to mining the data and start to talk about what are our individual communities of teachers? What are they saying? So if I were to give any advice to leaders, it's to put great leaders in schools that all teachers want to follow, but also give them agency and provide communities where they feel safe, empowered, and their cultures and their identities and lived experiences are celebrated.
Thank you so much, Harrison. Sharif, I'm going to turn to you next. So CBED, I'm sure everyone joining this call, if you haven't, you should know CBED is bringing deep insight into the practices and the policies that it takes to recruit Black teachers and leaders into schools. We see that through CBED's leadership in the We Need Black Teachers campaign, also leadership on the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign. And then, of course, the specific work CBED is leading in Pennsylvania. So I was wondering if you could speak and share more about that work and also what you see as some of the biggest barriers to recruiting and retaining teachers and school leaders of color.
Yes, thank you. Number one, we're grateful to be part of this, coalition and this movement to recruit 1 million teachers of color as well as 30,000 leaders of color. We believe it's absolutely critical. I'm also just really honored when you mentioned the We Need Black Teachers campaign. That's actually our high school students campaign that we're helping to amplify. So that actually didn't come from us. That came from our high school teacher apprentices who were, paid apprentices who learned how to teach while they're in high school, teaching first, second, and third graders. And so for them to come up with what they call, quote unquote, our rallying cry and demand. So I think, one of the biggest barriers is not looking at high school students as talent. When I think about when I became an educator, it was after I graduated from college. The first group of Black men that we were kind of lifting as we climb, as to quote Mary Church Terrell, and we were supporting other Black men. We realized that we were from all over the country, all of us master's degree and above, successful in leading schools and classrooms. None of us had been invited into the profession until after we graduated from college. And when we spoke to our colleagues, most of them were white women, as Harrison pointed out, their average response was third grade. So third grade was one group, and most of them white women who said oh yeah, that's when I remember having a conversation with an adult about becoming a teacher. Someone telling me, hey, you'll be a great teacher one day. Hey, you should lead a classroom, and giving them some, some responsibilities that continue to, pique their interest. And for us, we were all 17 of us were asked to enter the classroom after we had graduated from college. So it was almost as if we weren't looked at as a part of the talent pipeline. And so I would say that is one barrier that's not often, spoken about. Like, how are we engaging high school students in early career pathways to become an educator? And I would say, I was on my way to law school. Education was not even on my radar until I met a veteran Black educator, Dr. Martin Ryder, who invited me into the profession. And he recognized that I had a deep passion for my community, a deep passion for educational and racial justice. And he said, oh, you can fulfill all of that desire to have that type of impact by leading a classroom well, by teaching well. And, that kind of started my 30-year hiatus from law school, and I've been in education ever since. I've not looked back. And I'm really grateful that he invited me into the profession. And one of the things that's core to our work at the Center for Black Educator Development is to engage high school students and give them and pair paid apprenticeships where they're learning how to teach by teaching with CTE, dual enrollment, with the idea to engineer early career pathways and early exposure and clinical experiences, where if they're interested in teaching and leading classrooms, that they can graduate high school with an associate's degree in education and a paraprofessional certificate. We recognize that we can't disconnect the career pathway into education for communities of color from the financial situations that many of us are in, right? And so making sure that we are finding ways to get college credit, to give them a little bit of a head start, but also continuing to support them. So our apprenticeship starts in high school, but it goes throughout college, and we look at it as a long term. So I think one other barrier, and sometimes in policy, things are looked at as short term, investments are short term. That program that Dr. Martin Ryder started only lasted about 3 years. We look at the Black Teacher Pipeline as a 12-year process. This 1 million teachers of color is a process. High school, college, and as well as their early career supports, so that we are addressing the cracks. We believe this Black Teacher Pipeline has to have, insulation as well as pillars to hold it up and to shore it up. And I think, this is why this coalition, I think, is so important. We're matching policy and practice, practitioners, but hearing the voices across the spectrum, from leadership as well as the youth, who are really the ones who are our future leaders. And then I think another really important piece is understanding from a policy and practice perspective, what is the ecosystem that we're inviting this 1 million teachers of color into? What is the ecosystem and the conditions that we're inviting 30,000 leaders of color into? And so without understanding that, and again, listening to people's voices, their lived experiences, and recognizing like, okay, this is what we have to include to ensure that this pipeline is solid and a long-term investment in order for it to be successful.
I appreciate those remarks, Sharif. I'm hearing a couple of things, in terms of, for the folks on the call who came to hear about some of the best practices and policies, hearing the importance of that, building up that early career recruitment from the beginning, like really thinking intentionally about that and creating supports, and then addressing some of what we know to be true from the data, the financial barriers that exist, and supporting that and wrapping people with wraparound supports around it, so they can really, as you said, I love that idea of like a pipeline that's insulated and held up by pillars so that it carries throughout. Because the impacts, the dividends of that investment will live on for generations. So it's transformative. I wanted to also ask you, Sharif, because something that Harrison mentioned around, and you did it as well, of like, what is the environment then that we're also inviting people into? And I know you particular in CBED have written about the invisible tax. And so I just would love, just especially because of some of what Harrison just mentioned, if you could talk a bit about that, particularly if folks who are joining us aren't aware of that, because that certainly speaks to the conditions that we're inviting specifically educators of color into.
Yes, absolutely. You know what? One of our in addition to the pathways, we do, obviously we're part of this, so policy and advocacy, but, the second pillar for us is professional learning. So we match professional learning with the pathways, the high school, college, paraprofessional entry point. Policy and advocacy is really professional learning. Like, what are people's mindsets about, teaching and the students that they serve? We have to recognize that so many students who are in high school, students of color, are deterred from teaching based off of how they're experiencing school and what they're experiencing. Some of them, as we do focus groups with students, some of them talk to us and said, I like the idea and concept of teaching. I'm not sure if I would want to be colleagues with my current educators. And that's a really, sobering, idea that our youth are sharing with us. And we look at, one, having culture responsive, sustaining educational frameworks as a part of this, invisible tech is ongoing professional learning. A lot of our professional development, both synchronous and asynchronous, centers around mindsets. Like, how are people thinking, not only of the students in front of them, but of the communities that sent them to us? And how are we considering them? And in our Freedom Schools traditions, the idea is train your replacements. Well, so we have to teach as if these future teachers are sitting in front of us and that they are going to replace us. And so what is that experience, that they're having? How are we thinking about it? But then also, as you mentioned earlier, the retention piece. There are too many school leaders and colleagues who are oblivious to the lived experience of people of color as they're entering the classroom. I can say from direct conversations from many Black educators, we also did a joint report with Donors Choose, tying into Black men specifically what their experience. And I was appalled to see that some of the same things I experienced 30 years ago is exactly what Black men were saying today about their lived experience and the invisible tax, that they saw and felt while they were in schools, teaching and leading schools. And so this has to be part of the retention program. But if people are oblivious to my lived experience and I'm experiencing racial tension as a professional, but it's also reminded me of some of the experiences I had as a student, where I may not have had a language for it when I was younger, but I realized, like, what, I'm having trouble of being a full human being, being respected as a full human being in the curricula and what's taught, and some of the comments are made. And we know several studies show that, students of color experience their teachers, racial biases as early as 3 or 4 years old, and it doesn't stop, right? And so if I'm a professional, I'm experiencing racial tension now from colleagues and supervisors. It's, hearkening memories of what I experienced as a child, but then now I'm in a position to try to support students who look like me. And so that trifecta, and that's before I get to lesson planning, data management, research, relationship building with students, families, and community, grading papers. That's before I get to all of that. And then there are a lot of people who are just oblivious to the experience of being a person of color, and often what is often a very isolating, very sometimes disrespectful, unfortunately, space.
Really appreciate that perspective, Sharif. Thank you. Lynn, I saw you come off mute briefly, so I wanted to make sure that I opened up if you were reacting to something.
Oh, I was when I was listening to some of the things we're mentioning, I was just thinking about some places where we definitely know where states can make an investment and do so many things policy-wise. I didn't, so I just wanted to put a pin into that. I don't want to get in front of Kim, but that there are definitely ways that state leaders and even local leaders can make investments, have some of these things happen so we can make more systemic changes. And so I just want to make sure to mention those, make it really concrete on what we can be doing.
Fantastic. We'll definitely circle back around that, because that is the focus of today's discussion. So appreciate that. Kim, would love to hear more, your perspective really about some of what we're just talking about, some of the promising policies and innovations. But I'd love for you to start with, as I'm sure a lot of folks know, TNTP and the Hunt Institute came together to establish this campaign, quickly brought on the 6 other organizations that make up our steering committee to lead this. And so I'd love to hear from you, why did TNTP need to launch a campaign focused on this with these partners to influence policy practice and mindsets to focus on this specific issue? And then apart from that, what are some of the promising and innovative policies or practices that you are seeing from your perspective that the campaign can, lead on to improve the quality, quantity, and diversity of the educator pipeline?
Thanks, Nithya. I appreciate it so much. I'm listening and writing all these notes. This has been an amazing panel so far. So thank you, Harrison, Lynn, and Sharif. I also want to say my heart is with those in the Nashville community today, of course. So, TNTP has been doing work for more than 25 years now, starting primarily in the talent space and going to academics and continuing to increase into the spaces of community-led change as well as policy. And I really want to underscore a lot of what's been said, but also just say the obvious thing. This issue is not a new issue, right? So this has been happening for some time. And in particular, I want to lift up the fact that in 2020, TNTP actually published the report, The Broken Pipeline, and it was really focused on looking at data. And I'm thinking about you, Lynn, when you said transparent, actionable data, looking at the data about these teacher prep programs and what was happening, because these were the pipelines of our teachers coming in. And we saw, again, a teacher prep gap, right? Diversity gap, where most on average, of our program enrollees of those prep programs were folks who identify themselves as white, whereas we know that most of our children in our school systems are less than half of those students. So there's a huge diversity gap that was sitting there. And as you said earlier, when you started talking about the campaign, we started looking at the numbers and said, okay, how we're going to close this gap. We got to this number of 1 million teachers, 30,000 teacher leaders. And we knew we couldn't do that alone, right? That is a pretty significant number. And at TNTP, while we're very proud of the work that we've done over the past 25 years, being in more than 300 districts and being across states, we know that we need a collective voice and we need a collective power. And that was the way that we had to do it. And so grateful for the partnerships of 7 other organizations for us to lock arm in arm together to really make sure that we would be able to make this very real and scalable impact for our students. And, and when we talk about some of the promising practices, and we can definitely talk about what it means at multiple levels, because we don't want there to be any rock on not overturned, right? If it's at the national level, state, local, and and one of the things that's important to me is I'm a school board member, so I know what it is about looking at this stuff as a school board member and going, okay, what does this mean for my teachers in my district? And we're talking about some of the things we already mentioned in terms of what is going on in our actual schools in terms of our culture. I'm just thinking about the deep stuff that Sharif was talking about, Harrison. Our teachers of color are outstanding and they're exhausted. And what are we doing in our terms of our policy work and our practice work to support those teachers? When I'm a school board member and by the time I see the reports and even the contracts, the work is sometimes already done. So we really have to be able to get in front of it so you're actually able to inform this work. And I know, a little bit later, we're going to talk about some really tangible pieces and recommendations that we can actually do. But, again, with the broken pipelines, that we need more of these teachers of color to be in the pipeline. And now we have a lot of teachers and we got some progress that actually happened, right? So how is it that we're going to make sure that now that we have this pipeline that we've been repairing, that now we're not going to just go ahead and leave the leaks as is? And if anything, as we're looking at these realities that we're about to be challenged with, especially around the fiscal cliff, that we're going to leave these teachers behind.
Thank you, Kim. As you said, this is happening at so many levels. And as some of the panels have talked about, both in terms of policy making and practice, but also just like literally across the entire pipeline. So the challenge is complex. And I'm sure for anyone joining the call who is working directly in systems and leading those systems, or as a policymaker, it can seem insurmountable. So it's a perfect pivot, Lynn, I think, to where you wanted to kind of take us in terms of like, of course, there is no silver bullet in anything, and certainly when it comes to this issue. But as you are thinking about, as you mentioned and wanted to raise, like some of the concrete policies that do offer potential for bigger impact, would love to hear that from your perspective and a trust perspective of your research, what you feel like in terms of policy change or what states are doing, like holds some particular promise.
Sure. So first, I must say that, as I said before, like a lot of this has to be specific to what the data says in your state context. So this is my chance to definitely uplift and amplify our tool, where you can go to 50 state scan in terms of educator diversity policies in a state to see based on five metrics of criteria, five criteria metrics on how your state is doing on five things that we know usually are very helpful with the recruitment and retention of educators of color. But when I was listening to, we were talking about, we keep bringing up the idea of data. I mean, one of the most easiest things to do, right? And I said it before, but I just want to keep saying it, is just publish it. Put it out there. I mean, it means a lot what you can do on the school level. I'm talking about on the school level, where you can see, if I go to my son's school, and 1 year, there's so many teachers of color, so many Black teachers, Latino teachers, et cetera. And then in 3 years, the numbers go down, we've got a problem, And so leaders within the school can tell that, district leaders, school board members, everybody's looking at the same numbers and can identify the problem. And then we can start addressing the problem. So that's what I mean with like targeted strategies for actually getting to the problem and addressing the issue. So that's one thing on a very local level. And we have places like in Massachusetts and Delaware, they're already doing that. But can you believe it? We really only uplift those two states that are doing it. Maybe some others, but those are the two that often come up because they've been doing it the longest, Massachusetts and Delaware. The question, and Kim just brought this up in terms of teacher prep programs. Who's in those programs? What is the racial demographics of who's entering those programs? And then we can get into disaggregated data in terms of who's entering them, and then who's completing them and where are they going. Again, right now we have two states that we know are doing a pretty good job with that, Tennessee and Illinois, but it is a problem that we're only really seeing that done really well, best practices in two states, I'm hopeful that there will be more, but like that just gives you an idea of, again, things that can be done. We can get the numbers, we just need to do it, And then I just want to, I know Sharif brought up the mentorships and the pathways and how important that is. And I think what's wonderful about, the work that Sharif's organization is doing is that it starts in high school, and starts really early. And so one thing we're seeing though, in terms of some of the state policies, if you make the investment, even for college students, where they can have this apprenticeship and the clinical experience as they're in school, they're going into schools, getting that sense of what it's like to teach. They're talking to other educators of color. This is a way of coaching, mentoring. What are you getting into? And that often we heard when we did our report with educators of color some years ago, that was happening. They either didn't have that or was happening way too late, by the time you're almost losing them. And so we can see that states can make that kind of investment in those kind of programs. And even honestly, with some of the federal dollars that came out under COVID, and some of the relief dollars, even districts can make that kind of investment in these kind of programs where you have these partnerships between school districts and teacher prep programs. One place where that has happened is definitely the state of Minnesota. And we're very hopeful. Looks good, and I'm hopeful that we'll get the data soon on what the outcomes are, but definitely a best practice that we're uplifting and encourage folks to take a look at.
Thanks, Lynn. It's so helpful to hear about where where there is bright spots in model practice. It's easy. I've been in the policy space for some time, so it's easy to write about this stuff. It's harder to do it, of course. And so it's really helpful to hear about those practices. Harrison, I saw you come off mute. Would love to.
I just sort of wanted to connect a couple super powerful points that I'm hearing in the conversation. There's no question this work is hugely technical, but I'm also hearing that there is this adaptive work that has to happen. And I really think when you get the adaptive work, that's when you really start to see change. For instance, we talk about we have to respect the profession. We have to elevate teachers. We have to pay them what they're worth. What that does, though, that shows teachers that we care, we value, and then they begin to become ambassadors of their own their own profession. But the best recruiting tool for students are teachers that find joy in what they do. So, how do we create that ambassadorship with teachers? The second piece, I think, is that we've got to think about, and I say this time, we do have to look at policy. I'm a recovering superintendent. Most of you guys know I spent a little time in the superintendency. And one of the biggest challenges was this last in, first out. Like, how do we celebrate teachers and the work, the experience that they bring to the table, but also know that this is an innovation lab that we have to support. We cannot wait for the next COVID. We can't wait for this next forced innovation. We have to act now. And I always get myself in trouble when I say this, but I'm with family, so I'll say it. If we truly want to change this, we have to change the experiences of our Black and brown children. I cannot be in a system where I'm a part of a fraternity or sorority that's suspended more than any other demographic, that's labeled needing special needs support, don't have access to gifted or talented or AP. So when you talk about just this lifting this 30,000 leader and 1 million teacher of color work, we've got to really deeply think about like the adaptive, Sharif talked about, before you get to lesson plans and data and leading in, we've got to think about, do I understand the children that are in front of me? Do I respect and love and care for and celebrate? I listened to the Chancellor of New York the other day, and he was saying that lingualism is a superpower. Celebrate that. So I think as we begin to shift, that adaptive work becomes just increasingly critical.
Many head nods, many head nods. Perfectly put. Adaptive and technical both have to happen. Technical to scale the practices, but nothing will matter. And echoing Sharif's chat here, if we are not honoring and treating the experiences of the very people that we are aiming to educate. Beautifully put. Wanted to ask a question for all of you, and then I'll ask one more question from there, and then we've gotten quite a few really fantastic questions in the Q&A, and so we'll shift over to that a little bit after the hour. But so question open to all of you. There's a known refrain in policy and in school that there's a known refrain that policy and school happen to students and families and educators. And so, particularly for the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, we're really cognizant of how do we work alongside the folks who are impacted by these systems, who are central to this conversation. So I'm curious to hear from you. What are ways that your organization has successfully engaged students, families, and educators in policy change and the advocacy process? And what advice do you have for policymakers and practitioners as you all are advancing that kind of mindset in the work?
Yeah, I think that's such a critical, critical question. I think, I wish more educators as well as policymakers, went to the El-Mekki servant leadership, training grounds, to really understand, what does it mean to center communities? I think at the Center for Black Educator Development, we really start with we listen. I mentioned the We Need Black Teachers campaign coming. This is from high school students saying this is what they want. But we do that with other stakeholders, how we design our Freedom School Literacy Academy. We were actually going to stop it, pause it at least for in 2020 with the pandemic, because it's an in-person, intergenerational teacher apprenticeship model. And the high school and college youth, as well as parents, said, no, we should still do it virtually in 2020. And initially I said, all I'm hearing is about how miserable people are with online learning. And they said, no, this will be different because the community that we know is transferable. And I'm so glad we listened. It went so well that we kept it as part of our model now. And so now not only do we have the in-person, but we kept a virtual model for those who are not in the four cities, Memphis, Camden, Philadelphia, and Detroit, that we're in person. So I mentioned earlier, like our work with Donors Choose, listening to Black men, which came out of earlier work that we saw, that we read, that we studied with Ed Trust and Teach Plus. If you listen, we will stay. That elevated and centralized, educators of color, and then like what would get them to, retain and lower attrition rates, which we also know strong retention plan is the best recruitment plan. And from that, we wanted to dive in even deeper. So here's educators of color, and we will listen. If you listen, we will stay. Then we wanted to, we worked with Teach Plus to dive into Black educators and what they were expressing. And that's entitled To Be Who We Are. Like being their authentic self, being respected for their lived personal and professional experiences to improve student outcomes and recruitment and retention efforts. We're working with American Institutes of Research and Public Agenda to continue diving into and listening to stakeholders to understand, what's happening. And then I would say also our work with the Pennsylvania Educator Diversity Consortium, where based off of educators' feedback, we created toolkits, including retention toolkits that now we're supporting leadership teams in schools and principal supervisors on like how to retain the educators that you brought into the profession so that they don't come in the front door and run out the back door. And so we have now toolkits for mentorship, toolkits for culturally responsive teaching, toolkits for recruitment efforts. And I would just encourage policymakers and practitioners again to listen to the youth who are often the unheard and unheralded. We know back in 1967 in Philadelphia, we had Black students walking out of school to demonstrate, and some of the things that they had on their list was more Black teachers. And, Arundhati Roy said there's no such thing as the voiceless, right? That there's only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And I want to also just lastly double click on what Lynn talked about as far as the data and why that's so important. Up until recently, Pennsylvania did not share any of that data, even though they were collecting some of it. We need to make sure that's implemented. The previous administration, signed that into the new school code. We didn't have CTE credits for K-12 education. Now that's part of the school code, but without transparent data, that wouldn't exist. And we know from data, shout out to Dr. Ivory Tolson, that teaching is actually the #1 career choice for Black men in college. If they're in college, they have a degree, teaching is actually the #1, career choice. So imagine if they have better school experiences. Imagine if more of them are actually prepared in their K-12 experience to be college ready and to have that early career experience, career pathways, then we will increase the numbers, right? They're already saying, back to data, oh, this is our #1 career choice. We have to expand that pipeline for them to even be college and career ready.
Thank you, Sharif. Would love to hear from any one of our other panelists, strategies or the importance of engaging community and how to do that effectively when it comes to this issue.
Well, yeah, here at TNTP, we're very fortunate because we have this multi-pronged approach. We're able to do this work. One way is just having the platform of like the Teaching Fellows programs that we have, how we do our professional development and our leadership development work and the partnerships that we have with the districts. But I also really wanted to lift up the work that we do in our communities and with our parents. Sometimes, as much as I love policy advocacy work, people use words like policy and advocacy to intimidate other folks. So they're not part of the conversation, right? And instead, should be asking our young people, our families, our community, what are your hopes and dreams? What's important to you? And that's actually how you can shape real change in policy and inform it. And instead, sometimes it becomes like, well, let me show you all this data, or can you actually just review what I've already put out there, which we know is closer to things like tokenism and all that, and not exactly providing. And as Sharif, I just think about what you just said. These should be your decision makers on policy that are sitting at the table with you. Because the other wonderful thing about a lot of our teachers of color is they are of community, right? Many of our teachers are of community. When I was growing up, my teachers, they lived down the street from me when I had my Black and brown teachers. And I could see you at the grocery store. They were part of my life as an experience as a student. And that's what we want. And we have so many different opportunities to do that. So again, at TNTP, we have our community-led work. We have the partnerships that we will help districts. If you're struggling with having an authentic partnership and relationship with your families, that's something that we will work on. The other thing I want to lift up also is the parent advocacy groups. I think it's just so important. Those parents come together and share what has many times been painful experiences for them. Find out, guess what, it's not just them. It's many times the entire group of parents. How many times have we heard it's about special education, or I actually don't have access to the school and the school leadership and communications? For our parents and families who, where English is not their first language, who say, I can't even get the information. I'm willing to go to the school, take the time off, and I can't find anyone to talk to. So those parents are able to advocate for themselves and each other in a very special way. And I think that that's really critical on how is that informing our work in policy and advocacy.
Thank you so much, Kim. All right, I'm going to ask my last question to you all, and then get into some of those audience questions. But would love to hear. So, and Kim, you just talked about this, and I just appreciate it. Policy can often be used intentionally to keep people out of a conversation, and it also can be amorphous, or this thing that happens in state capitals or in DC, and it is not for everyone. But we know, everyone on this panel certainly knows, that the reality is policy is being made at every level, and at the school level, districts, LEAs, regions, et cetera, et cetera. So, and Lynn, I'd love to start with you, and then I would love to hear from everyone, but what advice would you give policymakers who want to focus on quality and diversity of their educator core, while also solving for the persistent or new educator challenges that they're currently facing?
For the policymakers, I guess starting with listen, put out an invitation, and then just listen. I think that sometimes we make it really hard. We talk about all this, the engagement and stakeholder engagement and community outreach. We often hear like, this is so hard to do, and it doesn't have to be that hard. It starts with an invitation, and making sure that you are listening to what you're getting, the questions that you're getting, the feedback you're getting, and just make it an authentic engagement in that way. With that said, I also think it's important that we try our best to realize that sometimes we do have two different languages going on, like a policy speak, which, even some of your friends who are in that policy space can get caught up in, along with the rest of the people who are living in the real world. And so one of the things that we really are proud of at Trust is trying to be a bridge between those two. And so from educators of color, when we released the If You Listen, We Will Stay report, that's when we started really bringing together and convening educators of color and saying, these are the conversations that are often happening at these policymaking tables, decision-making tables, where you should be and should be part of it. and let's just cut through all the fluff and get down to what it's about, the implications for you and students, and what does it mean in your schools. And so that way, when you go into these conversations, when you're looking at the same data, but there's certain questions that you want to ask, how does that look? When you're doing a policy analysis, the kind of questions that policymakers might ask their staff versus the questions that you really want to know, like how do you start bridging those two worlds together? It does take some some work, and then also just some folks who are in both worlds. And like I said, that's one thing that Ed Trust really we are really proud of, is that being that bridge is something that we think is really, really important, and we're happy to play that role.
Go ahead, Harrison.
Yeah, we've said it a couple of times. We just have to demystify this thing called policy. We were all raised on policy. My grandmother had a policy. My policy is before that little street lights come home, go on. That's my policy. When we go in this grocery store, I got just enough money to get what we need. Don't ask me for anything. That's policy. So how do we demystify policy? And I don't want to reduce our communities or anything like that we aren't capable of solving and engaging in complex, but it's so intimidating sometimes. So how do we demystify this thing called policy? And then how do we show our communities, how do they see themselves in that policy? And then one of the things that I just thought about, like, what is that recursive cyclical conversation about that policy? Sometimes we just implement it and it is what it is. Do we circle back with community to see how is it going? This is your policy. Is it working? Should we think about augment it? Should we accelerate it and amplify it? I think as gosh, the team is right. The policy can be intimidating, but we've got to figure out just ways to bring folks in and sort of demystify this thing and then have their footprint on this thing that we call policy.
Yeah, I love that. Shout out to the mamas and grandmas with all these policies. Too many policies when I was a kid, I think, but I feel you on that. I think, just from a school and a district perspective, because sometimes I 100% agree. Sometimes it's like looked at it so far away. I remember when I was a teacher and a principal initially, before I did my fellowship at the U.S. Department of Ed, I was just like, oh, forget those policymakers, just stay away. I don't need to hear from them. I don't even need to read what they're saying, until I, later as I matured as a principal, realized, wait a minute, this stuff is touching our school, like I need to, learn more and weigh in. I think a big part of that can happen at the school and district level is really thinking deeply about retention, strategies. One of the things that teachers say that would retain them, because all of them don't want to leave the teaching classroom, but they feel like sometimes one hand is tied to the opposite foot, and they say, okay, I got to lead a classroom in order to impact the next generation. But they felt like, I really want to stay in the leading a classroom. So creating these hybrid models, thinking about the teacher roles differently, making sure that there's teacher leadership. Like I said, I was a principal ambassador fellow at the U.S. Department of Ed. There's some states that do something similar. We also had a teacher ambassador fellow, that worked directly with the Secretary of Education and their his or her cabinet. That can happen at school and district levels, because it's really about elevating the voices. We know Teach Plus has a policy fellowship to make sure that teachers are more connected to what's happening in the policy space, which I think is just an incredible opportunity that districts can work with Teach Plus and other organizations that have things set up. I would say financial support. Suppose districts said, maybe less for schools, but particularly for districts that said, you know what, if you commit to teaching for X amount of years, your ride to college is free. Your master's degree is free. Your certification process is free. I know us as a nonprofit, we launched the Future Black Teachers of Excellence Fund. We raised $1 million just to provide support to teacher apprentices. And we're working with the United Negro College Fund so that these students, as part of this fellowship, because they're leaving high school, they're committing to education. And regardless of where they teach in the cities we partner with, the collective bargaining agreement, it comes from us, and so we work with UNCF to create a fellowship where they're Black Teacher Pipeline Fellows. And not only will they receive last dollar scholarships while they're in college, but they'll also get retention bonuses once they get to their 5th year of teaching, right? And we're doing this as a side, but that's something districts can do. It could be like the District X promise, the Philadelphia promise. If you commit to teaching here, if you commit to lifting as you climb and pouring into the next generation, we're going to give financial support because we are cognizant of the economic disparities that educators of color also are going through. And then the last two, I would say something around induction. Like, what does induction look like? How can it be tailored and targeted for educators of color? But then also that so many, teachers in general leave their educator prep programs and they say that they are unprepared to teach, particularly how to teach children of color. Like, that number goes up. So many of them say, I'm not prepared to teach. My educator prep program did not prepare me. There are not enough teacher residencies. There are not enough professors that understand what does it mean to teach the youth today. But if they don't know how to teach and treat students of color, why would we assume that they know how to interact with teachers and leaders of color? And so having professional learning experiences for educators to make sure that they are, being just as they teach and lead classrooms and schools can be a critical part that is at the school and district level.
So I'll be quick. I want to plus one on everything what everyone said. Policy is every day. Okay, policy is just every day. As a school board member, you just talked about the word investment. We just had to approve school budgets. It's interesting though, because when we talk about teacher diversity and our education leader diversity, it becomes a separate conversation than the budget. Don't allow that to happen. This should be helping to inform every decision you make on your strategy, on your budget, on your partnerships, all of the investments. When you look at a school district, most of us, when we're looking at that pie, a huge slice are educators, many of who are in the classroom. And so there's millions and millions and millions of dollars we are investing. And I think that we could be investing in a really smart way. The other thing I would say is try to get into the conversations earlier. Many times as a school board member, we're at the back end. All the other stuff is done. They tried to tie it up in a bow and they're trying to get you just to say, the night of the regular board meeting, right? You want to be able to be earlier in the conversation so that you can also shape it. Because one of the worst things that happen to usually a school district is for board members to start asking questions at the end and they start telling you all these timeframes and issues that they have. But really, this should be connected conversations. It's just so critically important. Just really quickly, one of the things we think are important is to grow your own programs, right? Now, I will tell you, those programs are amazing. We need to work on how we can scale those programs. How can we invest more? That's your school board. Your school board gets to decide that. So again, policy is every day. It doesn't have to be this intimidating thing. And it is something that collectively as a board, you have a lot of power to not just, again, most boards actually get to write the policy of their districts, but also to see all of this work through in partnership with your superintendent.
Thank you. Just such a robust conversation. I cannot thank you for enough. I'm going to leave my thank yous for the end and for email as well. We've got a lot of really great questions. And so I want to dive into those in a remaining 10-15 minutes. And while I do this, we're going to drop a link in the chat for a survey. We know that this is the first of the 1 Million Teachers of Color webinar, and we really want to gauge our, the appetite and the interest in these. And so please do us a favor and take that so that we can ensure that we're targeting these as we continue on, as well as the other work this campaign continues to do. Briefly, we've gotten 2 questions around the role of higher education and educator preparation programs. One mentioned most schools of education are filled with white female students. What are the plans to lobby states to impact schools of education and colleges and universities to do more to recruit candidates of color into their programs? Another person mentioned, typically we don't see higher education involved. Are there steps to get them more involved in this conversation? Because this is where the rubber meets the road. Would love to hear from, maybe Sharif, I can direct this to you, but if there's anyone else who'd want to, weigh in here, and I'll mention that the campaign, in terms of our strategy, we plan to enter into states where we feel like we can make a difference. We want to understand what that context is, and then invite folks to the table who want to work with us. Higher education has to be a part of that. our strategy is really going to depend on the local context because we want it to be meaningful and to respect the effort and the work going on the ground in a state, and we don't want to parachute in. But Sharif, I'd love to just hear from you what you see as, I mean, you know, from these two questions, higher education is obviously a huge stakeholder in this, and just love to hear your reactions and ways to get them to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, this is an important part, is part of the, the pipeline, an important part of the pipeline. We'd be remiss if we didn't recognize that HBCUs produce half of the Black teachers. So one, that's a fact, right? Like that, those are, particular spaces that hone and support future Black teachers, and they've done that since their inception in many places. But we also have to recognize that many of them are unjustly underfunded. I know in Pennsylvania, there's, I believe a pending lawsuit that, about that, Cheney University and Lincoln University, the first two HBCUs are significantly underfunded. Many of these HBCUs actually cut their teacher prep programs because the financial constraints that they're struggling. So if we're serious about, a teacher pipeline that's diverse, we have to, invest in the places that, develop and produce HBCUs, MSIs, tribal schools, et cetera, is really important. The other one is we're working with some professors. I think right now we have over 1,000 undergraduate students who are taking our asynchronous course around, mindset and skills. They're taking these courses because the professor is saying, you know what, I need to better prepare my students to lead other students. And, the fact that they're acknowledging that, I think is really important. And so that would be the other piece I say, like, university, and as you said, Nithya, the coalition of folks that we can partner with at the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign to really change, okay, the people who are graduating paid us tens of thousands of dollars to our College of Ed. They're going in debt, and they're saying they're not prepared. Imagine doctors coming in and about to do some surgery on your child and say, hey, I'm not really prepared. And particularly, I'm not prepared to work on your child because they're a child of color. But yet, then that just continues to, manifest itself. So we really need a culture of collective work, responsibility, and accountability that includes our IHEs. And I know our 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign is open to working and supporting any of these IHEs that are really thinking about doing things differently. National Center for Teacher Quality has tons of data and research around, some of these issues that not only we're raising, but teachers are raising, that we see in student outcomes.
Yeah, I would just.
Lynn, please go right ahead.
No, I was just going to double click on the HBCUs and how important that is. I know even on the federal level, in terms of making the investment in our HBCUs and MSIs, that for years we've been supporting with the Augustus Hawkins program, putting in money, federal dollars into these schools and institutions. And it wasn't until last year that they actually got some funding in the appropriations bill. And I mean, that's years and years and years of people like us, advocates who have been pushing for it. And so we just have to keep that push going. We're concerned now that there will be perhaps even a cut this year. So, and those schools didn't get what they deserved last year. So to your point, that in order to address what we're talking about in terms of diversity, teachers of color, the prep they need, deserve, et cetera, we can't forget our HBCUs.
Yeah, shout out to all the HBCUs and the HSIs that are really doing great work. I think that work is critically important. And I think my comment is probably more of the question. I'm curious, what are our post-secondary partners learning from the last 3 to 5 years? Like what's the learning that has happened around teacher diversity and this forced innovation of COVID, and how are they shifting? And also give ourselves as PK-12 educators and post-secondary educators, sometimes we're the first to teach, but we're the last to learn. And I think we've got to think about the learnings that are out there. And because Sharif talked so much about Ella Baker, I would have loved to have gone to her leadership academy than any other administrative credentialing sort of academy. And
You can still
so I
come
think
to Freedom School Literacy Academy. We'll invite you to,
yeah, so I think we have to think about multiple and innovative pathways. Is that the only path to the end that we want to see, or the journey that we're on? So part of what I'm thinking is, what are we learning as a PK 14, 16, 18 system? How are we how those learnings showing up and how we're serving teachers and students? And then are there just unique and alternative pathways to get there? We have to look at teaching and teachers very different. Like the supply, the demand. I'm in Florida. So if you look at what's happening in Florida, it is forcing us to think differently. You can take your district dollars and go to your private school. What are the implications? You know, this whole notion about Chat GPT, you know, in some of my neighbors' schools that have to be private, they are using that and talking to kids around the innovation around that. In some spaces, they're trying to just expel it out of the conversation. So things are going to happen. The world is going to evolve. How are we evolving and learning from these things? Let's not be frightened for them. Let's embrace them.
Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. We got a question around what forms of data are needed. So I think Lynn, and this was directed to you, Lynn mentioned how data is important. What forms of data do you all think is best in capturing information that might be needed? So Lynn, would love to start with you and then have folks add in if they have a perspective.
I mean, honestly, we're starting with just the most basic data in terms of disaggregated data by racial groups. Like, we don't even have that. Harrison mentioned that often when we talk about educators and the educator workforce, it's in the aggregate. They're talking about all groups. And so just getting it broken down by racial groups would be a big step in a lot of places. And then we can also look at from teacher prep programs, where folks coming from, and you get into other things in terms of certification, alternate ways of going into the teacher force. I think that's also what Harrison was just talking about. So there are levels of it, but just starting with the racial demographics and data would be a good start.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Question, and I'm going to direct this to Harrison, but I think all of our panelists will have perspective on this, so we'd love to open it up after Harrison provides some remarks. But we got a question: how are schools and districts ensuring they're providing mentoring, support, and training that values teachers of color, rather than telling teachers of color how pedagogical or standards require them to teach students?
Yeah, so I'll be really quick. So I think when we look at IMSEL's theory of action, it's quality, quantity, and care. And that care piece is so critical because, Nithya, you brought up this idea of the invisible tax. And I think when school districts understand that there has been a different playbook for leaders and teachers of color, we have to navigate a whole different set of competencies. One of the things that we're exploring now is IMSEL. Are leadership competencies that align to the leader of color experience. If you remember back, you're way too young, but back in the 30s through the 60s, we had this green book where Black folks would use this green book to go to various states. And you would read the green book to say what business was Black owned that you could patronize in that city so that you would be safe. So when you think about being a leader or a teacher of color, there are certain things that you have to navigate before you even get to the leadership standards or the leadership competencies. And I always use myself as an example. I'm 6'4", 250. I've been big, Black, and ugly all my life. That's not going to change. But at every juncture of my leadership career, assistant principal, assistant superintendent, superintendent, I've had to contend with this thing. Harrison, I am so intimidated by you. I'm afraid of you. You scare me. And then I sort of get into my coaching stance and say, well, could you describe the behaviors that you see in me that would cause you to fear or cause you to be, and they could never really just say, well, you yell or you fuss or you curse. We didn't do that. We trained ourselves not to do that. It's just this notion that you're this big Black man. So that's that, but that invisible tax is very, very difficult. It's draining. And the study out of Vanderbilt that talks about Black male teachers, their evaluations are lower than their counterparts, even when they're equally credentialed and even when their students score at or above. So we know that there is a norm. When I walk into a space that's not designed for me to be my authentic self, as much as I'd like to be, there's a playbook that I run. Okay, Pete, you big, you loud, you country, be very careful. Don't tower over these folks. Unfortunately, these are the rules of engagement that we've had to sort of coin as survival techniques. And I would like to be able to show up as our authentic self in every space. But the reality is the world isn't built that way. And that's the same context for teachers and leaders that I think we've got to be careful, but also we have to acknowledge. And I know it's a controversial topic in some spaces, but that's what we'll deal with. Because when we look at the ecosystem, when we look across the country, 80% of principals are white, 90% of board members are white, 90% of superintendents are white. So those are people that are making policy, that are spending dollars, that are building schools, that are drawing boundaries. So we have for an ecosystem that's overwhelmingly students of color. So we've got to be proximal to that as we sort of navigate the system, as we try to liberate ourselves and liberate the system in creating this new opportunity.
Here's, I'm thinking about it. It's, as a school board member, I'm in a community that's mostly brown and Black. And so that's, many times the folks that we see that come to our school board meetings, but that's rare, right? The one thing I would say to folks, especially if that is not the makeup of your school board and your school leadership, show up to those meetings, do your public comment. Because believe it or not, people are listening and writing down, and it's on public record. And for those folks who go out every single meeting and always have something, thank you. Even though it's like we know you very well, but thank you, because those are the voices we need to hear, because many times those voices are not diverse. And again, the school district, your school board, your school leadership, it's just, there is a lot of power there that we're not tapping into. I also want to lift up, some work that TNTP also does in terms of the Black Educator Excellence Cohort. I think about those spaces that are really important for, in this case, for groups to get together and folks to be able to support one another, learn together, create those relationships in those special spaces. And really think that is something that, others should consider as well. But it's definitely something that we do at TNTP that we believe is so, so important. And like a lot of things, again, you have to, as a district, lift up, is this going to be important to you? So again, even if you're not on that school board and you don't want to run, please run. But if you don't want to run for your school board, show up at those school board meetings and make sure that things are happening. Your voice is being heard.
Thank you so much, Harrison and Kim. When we were planning this webinar, we knew that we were going to push it with an hour and a half, and I am ready to keep talking for another hour. So I'm glad that we, made this space for a longer webinar, given it was our first. Two, just deep appreciation to everyone. I'm impressed by how many people have stayed, and the reactions on the chat. I'm not sure if our panelists have taken a look, but a lot of love, a lot of, I think, people resonating with a lot of the messages that you all said around data, around mentorship, seeing a very, very clear consensus around the importance of really thinking about how the educator preparation programs play a very critical role in this. All of this to say, the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign is going to be active. We are very much taking a strategy of coalition, and that means working with folks, not just the 8 steering committee organizations, but when we go into a state, understanding what that context is, understanding the policy and the implementation opportunities, and working side by side with advocates who've been leading this work for decades. And so thank you all for joining us on this first webinar. We are excited to continue these conversations at the very least on a quarterly basis, and then have activity going on in various states. So please sign up to join so that you can stay abreast of our updates. and take that that survey if you can to inform in terms of these conversations what we do next. Kim, Sharif, Harrison, Lynn, such deep gratitude for your expertise and your time as you are going all around the country and doing all kinds of things. And just a appreciation for this conversation that was authentic and real and also actionable. And a huge thanks to our partners at the Education Trust for co-hosting this with us and hosting just a really robust and great conversation. So thank you all. Thank you for your time, and everyone stay safe, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Bye all.